Dr. Ron Paul.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The Commission report, and I believe Governor Kane has mentioned it, that we have to use all the tools available to us. And yet, I think there's one tool that seems to have been neglected that I would like to suggest. It is the tool of rethinking our foreign policy and considering possibly that our foreign policy of interventionism helped precipitate our crisis. And I think at times the report alludes to this, that our presence in the Middle East and the Persian Gulf helped to serve to incite the terrorists. There was a base in Saudi Arabia which they were very unhappy about, and this motivated many of them to participate. And yet, we don't talk about that. If anything, the emphasis here is more of the same. You know, we need more money and more intervention, and that, to me, is discouraging, especially if it is correct that our participation over there has contributed to it. I was interested in the discussion on Egypt because I think that is very important and makes a strong point. You make a point in the Commission report that they have gotten more money than any other Muslim nation, and only 15% of the Egyptians support us. And I think that makes a point. My point, it doesn't work. And so more money, how can we expect better results? And I would say we should look to the Congress. If that's too much money for Egypt, you know, in the old days, the power of the purse was in the hands of the Congress. So I would say the responsibility lies with us if Egypt's getting too much money. And in Pakistan, the inconsistency of supporting a military dictatorship that overthrew an elected government that now has nuclear weapons and probably somewhere in Pakistan is Osama bin Laden. At the same time, a lot of men are dying to impose democracy in Iraq. It comes across as rather inconsistent. But you know, we had a few other crises that were handled differently than the one we've handled this time. In 1962, we had a crisis with missiles, and it was probably the most serious thing in the 20th century. Yet Kennedy stood strong and said to the Soviets, "Why did you do this?" He said, "Well, you have missiles on our border." So he quietly says, "We'll take our missiles back." Instead of poking more at the Soviets, they backed off, and the issue was diffused. Ronald Reagan, at the same time, when he confronted a crisis in the Middle East, in Lebanon, he wrote in his biography, he says, "Perhaps we didn't appreciate fully enough the depth of the hatred and the complexity of the problems that made the Middle East such a jungle. Perhaps the idea of a suicide car bomber committing mass murder to gain instant entry to paradise was so foreign to our own values and consciousness that it did not create in us the concerns for the Marine safety that it should have." Reagan pulled the Marines out within a few months. In the weeks immediately after the bombing, he said, "I believe the last thing we should do was turn tail and leave. Yet, the irrationality of the Middle East politics forced us to rethink our policy there." He moved back and no more Americans died. So I see this problem persisting, and that we're not saying maybe we should, you know, rethink some of the things that we do. Maybe sending more money to Egypt won't make them love us. Sending more money to Pakistan won't make them love us. So my question is this: if terrorism, as many believe, occurs as a reaction to our foreign policy, how can we defeat terrorism without changing that policy? And right now, I don't see any discussion in this regard.
Mr. Paul, the Commission discussed at some length this question of the relationship between terrorism and American foreign policy. And it's a very difficult matter. We tried to understand better Osama bin Laden's reasons for doing what he did. And I at least conclude, and I think the Commission does, that there are a variety of factors that came into play. Much of it is ideology, even theology. there isn't any doubt that he espouses a very radical view of Islam, and he wants to convert the world, if you would, to his view. And that's heavy in the fatwas that he pronounces. But also in those fatwas are grievances against American foreign policy. They're there. There isn't any doubt about it, and he exploits it. I was in the Congress when we decided to send American forces to Saudi Arabia. I think that was the right decision. That was in the late 80s, maybe the early 90s. I don't think we had a vote on it, although we may have. But foreign policy has consequences. And sometimes those consequences none of us can predict. Nobody got up on the floor when we decided to send troops to Saudi Arabia and said that's going to set off Osama bin Laden. But if we're to believe what Osama bin Laden says, then that's what triggered his hostility. Did we make a mistake in doing that? I don't think so. We protected a very important resource for us, and we had a presence in the Middle East that was very important. But it has unintended consequences. Now, the questions you raise about intervention, I think that's one of the great questions, maybe the great question of American foreign policy in the next several decades. When do you intervene and when don't you? You make the case, I think you make the case, that we ought not to intervene, period. I don't think I would agree with that. The Commission didn't address that question, but let's take the case of Afghanistan. We chose not to intervene in Afghanistan after the Soviets pulled out. And what happened? What happened was that Osama bin Laden found a sanctuary there, and that was the incubator of the attacks against us. If we had intervened, would it have changed? Well, nobody can say for sure. But the probabilities are that we would not have had Osama bin Laden attacking us because he wouldn't have had the sanctuary from which to develop his enterprise. So sometimes intervention means all different kinds of things. Sometimes it's military, sometimes it's diplomatic, sometimes it's humanitarian. And I think those are exceedingly difficult questions. But I do want to pick up on something you say that I think is very important, and that is the complexity of these matters. We tend to see them very simplistically. And we say, oh my, you got to intervene and clean it up. We'll be in there in a year or two, and then we'll get out. Well, it doesn't happen that way. And if you're going to intervene, you'd better decide to be there for a good long while. And you better be prepared to put the resources in to do it. And this raises the question of sustainability. How long will the American people and how long will you be prepared to put billions of dollars into any intervention? Just make it country X. How long will the American people be willing to support that? With all of the other things that crowd into their attention and all of the other international crises that will surely arise. So you're right to emphasize the complexity of these problems, number one, and I add to that the whole question of sustainability, the political will of the United States to maintain its interests. Let's take the country of Haiti. I'm getting a little off the Commission's report here. Take the country of Haiti. Episodic. That's our interest. We're in and we're out. We're in and we're out. We're in and we're out. Can't make up our minds on Haiti. Well, you raise, I think, the big question of American foreign policy. Maybe the toughest question of American foreign policy in the years ahead will be, when do you intervene? And that's incidentally a presidential decision. Congress doesn't play much of a role in that.
The gentleman's time has expired.
Presidents make the call. And I think it's going to be a huge, huge question for American foreign policy, because every American president is going to be asked again and again and again to intervene here, there, and yonder. Yep.
Ms. McCollum. Thank you. Mr. Paul, would you restrict yourself to 3 minutes?
I'll do my very best.
Thank you. That's all one can ask.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank Mr. Hamilton. Although this is my opening statement, I want to thank you for your answer to my question, because I thought your answer was very well thought out and balanced, and at least gave recognition to the fact that foreign policy does have unintended consequences too often, and they're unpredictable. My contention, I think, with the general thrust of the report is that it looks like we're placing the blame on a bureaucratic foul-up more so than anything else, and that maybe if we rearrange things and increase the size of some of our departments and send some more money, that we can compensate for the foul-up and the inability of the $40 billion we already spent on intelligence, and we're going to solve that problem. And hopefully it'll work, but I have my reservations. Of course, my big concern is, once again, that foreign policy is very, very significant. In the report, you talk about emphasis on counteracting the madrasas and their radicalization of some of the Muslims. But we also have to remember that when the Soviets were in Afghanistan, that was one of the tools of the CIA to go in and encourage exactly that radicalization. Once again, here's a point of on again, off again. Of course, you can say we should intervene more wisely. Then there are those others who might caution maybe a lot less intervention might be better. I do concede the point that there are some very great, very radical individuals there, like the Osama bin Laden, that hate our culture. But once again, he has to have a motivating force to recruit. And unfortunately, I think because we didn't back away and recognize some of our errors in foreign policy, that we've actually contributed to the recruitment of the al-Qaeda. I don't think there's evidence that al-Qaeda is weaker and there are less members. I think there's actually more recruitment. This policy of non-intervention should not be written off as isolationism, because I happen to believe in a very open society where people travel and educational exchanges occur and there's free trade. So this is a little bit different than pure isolationism and protectionism, and I throw those ideas out as suggestions. Thank you very much.